Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to our third and final session of today. This is, of course, our third annual Journalism Under Fire conference. We're thrilled to have you. My name is Sandy Campbell. I'm the Executive Director of the Santa Fe Council on International Relations. Earlier today, we heard from Malachi Brown from the New York Times talking about his amazing work in digital forensics and how that uncovered what Russia has been up to in Syria. And we have a number of sessions coming up tomorrow. Tomorrow morning at 10 a.m., we have Hannah Allam from NPR News leading a panel on the determinants of crisis, which will feature Dionne Brown from the Washington Post, who's just done some amazing reporting in Oklahoma. A reporter from Oklahoma, Ben Felder, who tell us all about what it's like to report progressive news in a ruby red state. And then we'll feature Tim Phillips, who leads, is the CEO and founder of Beyond Conflict, which is a Boston-based nonprofit that does a lot of work on partisanship and the psychology of partisanship. It's extremely interesting stuff. That's at 10 a.m. Mountain Time tomorrow. And then tomorrow night, we have a special double header. First, we're going to dip into how journalism has covered social crisis. And we're featuring Wesley Lowery from 60 Minutes and CBS News, Estede Herndon from the New York Times, and that'll be moderated by Russ Contreras, who writes for the AP down in Albuquerque. With immediately following that session, this is all one ticket gets you in, at 6:30 Mountain Time, we're featuring two fantastic political cartoonists, Jack Oman and Matt Worker. I've had a number of phone calls with them in the lead up to this, and they have been absolutely hilarious phone calls, and they're going to be showing some of their cartoons and walking us through sort of their decision-making in writing them, or drawing them rather, and then as importantly, what the reaction has been. We're going to talk about Charlie Hebdo. We're going to talk about why the New York Times doesn't have editorial cartoons. So we've got lots of exciting things in store. But more importantly, right now, we have two true powerhouses of American journalism who are going to walk us through some of the many currents that are happening right now, particularly around our drawn out electoral process. And we'll sort of dive into and behind some of the headlines these days. Of course, our moderator tonight is Dana Priest, who needs very little introduction on this stage, but she's a two-time Pulitzer Prize winner for the Washington Post, an author of various books, and is a Knight Chair of Public Affairs Journalism at the University of Maryland. And then we have E.J. Dionne. Welcome, E.J. He's a syndicated columnist for the Washington Post, a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, a university professor in the Foundations of Democracy and Culture at Georgetown University, and a visiting professor at Harvard University. So welcome to you both. We're thrilled to have you. And Dana, I'm going to turn everything over to you.
Okay, thank you. Well, I'm so glad to be here with EJ, who's I've known for so many years, and really, as I said in my tweet, and I don't tweet much, EJ is a journalist, and I say that in all of the best ways. He knows how government works, he knows how all of government works, which is a feat. He knows how the political system really works, and a lot of the people, many of the people inside of it, and how they really feel. He's trusted, he's honest, and he's one of the nicest people in Washington, honestly. So even though I don't run into him anymore these days, because nobody runs into anybody, I'm so happy to be here with him. And he's just written a book called One Nation After Trump. And he's also written about a dozen other books, maybe 2 dozen. It seems like you have a book out every 2 years.
I like you. I like keep inflating like that. It's good. Yeah. Actually, my latest book is called Code Red: How Progressives and Moderates Can Unite to Save Our Country. Just a little bit about what happened this week. But anyway, that's okay. Can I just say to the audience, being interviewed by Dana is like a minor painter being interviewed by Monet or Mary Cassatt. Really, because I think many of you know her extraordinary achievement. She has dug out information that the government didn't want out there, that had to be out there to save the honor of our country. And Dana is also one of those people who is such a delight to have as a colleague, as a friend. She lit up a newsroom. When she walked in, everybody was happy because they were happy to see her. So anyway, I can't thank you enough I'm so happy to be here with you.
All right, so let's start. Because you have a mind of a big thinker, and not just the daily, who's up, who's down. I wanted you to reflect for a minute first on journalism, because this is a journalism conference, or a conference about journalism. The overall title is Covering Crisis, and how we're doing in that regard. So I really did want you to focus on how have newspapers and TV handled the division of the country, and handled in particular what I'd call the Trump crisis. And then how have they learned over the 4 years, if they have? So what would your evaluation of that be?
Yeah, first, I really want to thank by the way, I apologize. There's a bit of instability in my connection. So once in a while, I freeze very briefly. We haven't figured out how to solve that problem. And our house has become, like a lot of houses, a WeWork space. We have my wife and I and my daughter and her boyfriend are all working under the same roof. First of all, I want to thank the folks who organized this for organizing this, and for their concern about journalism, because whatever worries we might have about journalism in the United States right now, and I do have some real worries, particularly about the financing of local journalism, which we can talk about. That is nothing compared to our colleagues around the world who live under governments that kill and jail journalists, and that has been going up, not down, in the world. And it's also to honor colleagues we have had who have been killed in the course of doing their jobs, particularly in combat, people who risked their lives in combat, and many of whom lost them. And so to have a group of people down in Santa Fe, one of the most wonderful places in the universe, by the way, take this interest in and concern for journalism is, it's in the public interest, but those of us who are in this business really appreciate it a lot. I also, if I could just shout out my old friend, Dr. Lou Gavioli and his wife, who live out there and who got me connected to this. Lou and I have known each other since college. And so when he called, I just had to do this. And then I learned about what it was, and I was happy to do this. I think in covering, there have been sort of a lot of ups and downs in covering Trump. But I think people got the hang of it as it went along. I think one of the most interesting early debates that really showed how problematic this all was the debate about whether you used the word lie when you were talking about Donald Trump. And now we have become so accustomed to using the word lie. Glenn Kessler, the fact checker for the Washington Post, has counted, I don't know, last I checked, it was 15,000 lies. It's probably gone up. It's like one of those, it's like when you get gas, when the gas prices are high, the way that turns over. But when it started, there was a big debate. Could you say lie? What did he have in his head, that he was consciously lying? Did we need to know that before we use the word lie? The New York Times was particularly conservative early on with arguments like that. I don't mean politically, I mean cautious about using the word lie. And over time, people got accustomed to the fact, oh no, he's lying. He lies all the time. You may correct him on the fact, and he'll repeat the lie again. And so over time, there was just no question that you actually had to use that word, or you were no longer telling the truth yourself. So that's one thing. I think secondly, and there are a bunch of us, particularly on the liberal side, who have sort of talked for years about a kind of false balance. And, the simple way to put it is, if, I say the sky is red and Dana says it's blue, you can't say there are two sides to that question. The sky is blue, the earth is round. Climate change is a real thing. And there's, and that false balance actually began to get in the way of telling the truth. And we live in an environment where, led by the president, but aided and abetted by all kinds of websites and, also foreign websites and the like, we are awash in misinformation. I always say that technology is amazing. It speeds the quest for truth and the spreading of truth, And it also speeds the spreading of lies. And more people get exposed to more lies more efficiently in this new world. And that's a problem. It doesn't mean the whole world is bad. I have more information on this whole thing than I could ever imagine having at my fingertips before. There are amazing good things happening because of technology, but it's also creating these problems. And then it was sort of covering Trump voters. That there were periods, I thought, when journalism was becoming a parody of itself. Let's go out and, well, gee, we missed this election outcome, so let's go out and interview Trump voters. It was almost like they were anthropologists going and studying strange tribes, as opposed to talking to fellow Americans who had political views and felt a certain way about things. There was almost a parody of this when a New York Times reporter went out into the Bronx and wrote a piece interviewing Clinton voters. And it was almost a parody of all those Trump voter pieces. And yeah, it's true that in 2016, lots of people were surprised that Trump won that election in the end. My own view is that no Comey, no Trump. I think the evidence, we can talk about that if somebody cares about it, but the evidence is overwhelming that Comey's intervention a week or so before the election really shifted it Trump's way. I also think that in the end, if you really wanted to understand what happened, you had to understand there was enormous hostility to Hillary Clinton. It wasn't that the whole country embraced Donald Trump. It was a lot of the country voted against Clinton. Now, I didn't feel that way myself. I have enormous respect for her, but a lot of people in the country didn't like her. And that ultimately is why Trump won the election. But as time went on, journalists, did everything they could to penetrate the inside of the Trump presidency to tell us what was going on. At the same time that they tried to maintain critical distance. And in all administrations, there is the challenge of, do you get too close when you try to get information and lose your critical perspective versus losing access altogether? But again, this administration presented that problem in an even more profound way, I think, than we've ever faced before. And I think an awful lot of journalists in the end did quite a good job telling us this story as it went along. There were moments when I winced a little over this or that story. And as a critic of Trump, I wondered, was that as tough as it should have been? But I wasn't covering the White House. And that was a really hard thing. And I think for the most part, people really walked that line who had to cover Trump and the agencies of our government. They walked that line pretty well. And I think served the rest of us pretty well in the process.
So another question about journalism for a minute. If you look at the papers
I'm
today,
curious what your answer to that question is, if I may ask.
What's that?
What? I said, I want to know what your answer to that question is.
Oh, no, let's stick with you.
As someone who, yeah, but just briefly, is your sense similar to mine? What?
I said, but that's a nice try. I want to keep you
Say
on.
again?
I said, that's a nice try to turn.
All right.
I'm just going to resist for a little bit longer. And then maybe we can do it.
Trying,
Okay, I will tell you.
Maybe the audience can do it. Put questions to Dana. Go ahead.
So, okay, I'll give you a little my opinion in my next question, which is when I look at the newspapers, especially on my handheld or online on the computer, now I have to wade through. I get a little bit of the big news. I get a lot of opinions, and then I get some more news. But the opinion writers are elevated in a way that they weren't before in a newspaper where you got them on the back. And there is, I think, a blurring of the line, especially in the minds of readers, even though they're labeled in tiny print opinion. And it seems to me that because of the type of presidency this is, and the type of emotional laden person that Donald Trump is, a lot of the headlines for sure became screaming at me, screaming, he's the worst president in all of history, right out the bat or whatever. But it just did blur the lines, I think, in my opinion. But I want to know, as a columnist, what do you think? Do you think that journalism has changed, or the business of journalism? It's we can make more money out of emotion laden opinion columns, and so they're put much higher than the columns that are just more objective, or not opinion, news. How do you see that? And does it matter?
Yeah, I have two. I think it probably does matter. I have two utterly contradictory opinions on this. I have the opinion as an opinion writer, where those of us who are in the opinion world notice that something like, I probably have this figure wrong, somebody can fact check me, but just to give an order of magnitude, it's like 40% of the traffic is us, is opinion. There's an enormous, whatever the right number is, it's a very high number. And there is an enormous thirst for interest in opinion out there. And opinion also gets trafficked a lot on social media. I'm on Twitter, I send out columns, I send out other people's columns. We're trafficked on Facebook and all over the place, so that we are now very much part of the economic lifeblood of the paper in a way that we probably weren't nearly to the same degree before. And if we were, you couldn't measure it before. Now it's extremely measurable.
Is that a good thing?
I still get, by the way, 4 paper papers at my house every morning. I still love the paper, partly because you can spill coffee on it without wrecking it like your computer, but partly also because I like the serendipity of looking through newspapers and finding on page A6 something I would never have found on my phone or my computer, and or a piece by somebody I like that I might not have seen pop up that I want to read. So I still love the paper, but that does make me a dinosaur. I like online as well, but I still love sitting down first thing in the morning to see what I've missed online. I do think that we began to blur these lines a long time ago, not so much in the newspaper, but in television media, where the newspaper roundtables on talk shows and the like went from being all journalists to a mix of journalists and columnists, and then even to a mix of journalists. And I think of columnists, by the way, as journalists. I just made a distinction I don't want to make, because I judge myself by the same standards of truth that as somebody in the news pages do. I don't have a right to lie just because I have a right to express my opinion. I have to worry about getting the facts right, just like someone on the other side. And I like to report. So once in a while, I like to tell people things they don't know. So I'll just say, traditional journalism and columnists rather than get us out of journalism. I think that, in all those old chat shows, when you started having a working day-to-day journalist, a columnist, and a political consultant, people out in the audience said, "What the hell is this?" And we all look like we were members of the same club. We talked in a friendly way to each other, which is the wrong with that. But I think that's where the problem started even before now. And yes, I suspect you're right that even though I'm very happy
should we do something about all of that, EJ? Should we reel that in, or somehow be more clear about what's opinion and what's not opinion? It would hurt the bottom line to do that.
Well, see, again, this is where I am conflicted, because as a columnist, I am very happy that our work gets displayed in a way people can find it, because given the way online works, if you buried us in the back, people might never find us unless they explicitly clicked on opinion, whereas a lot of the reading on the phone is what pops up first, what pops up on the front. And so we want to be there. I would agree with you that labeling us more clearly might be helpful. I think there's a whole debate about how high up, when you're scrolling down your phone or your computer, how high up should we be, or should we be? I think they're trying in some cases to segregate us off to the side. But yeah, I think it's a challenge for now. I think that there's less and less distinction in people's minds between, day-to-day journalism and opinion, and that is a problem. So I don't disagree with that.
So
on the other hand, I am personally
you,
grateful that people like to read opinion these days.
Let me ask you some non-journalistic questions, but how do you think our Constitution, our constitutional system is holding up under the last 4 years, and especially under this last year, and especially maybe even under this last couple months? How's it holding up in terms of checks and
And
balances?
possibly in the next 2 months.
And yes.
I'm sorry?
Yes, and how, checks and
and
balances in particular?
Yeah, I mean, so here's the part of the Constitution that has decidedly worked and remained intact. On the whole, freedom of the press has remained intact. We're still there. We're still reporting. They could attack us. They could talk about fake news. Trump could say whatever he wanted. We were still out there working, publishing. People were seeing us. That's a win for freedom, whether people like us or not. That's a win for freedom. Freedom of assembly was certainly intact. And the amount of, from the very first day of the Trump administration, the Women's March on January 21st, which is a really amazing event, both here and around the world, the ability of people to rally and say, we're here, we're watching, we have these views, we care about these things. And then going all the way through to the marches for racial justice after George Floyd and the other killings. So that part of our constitutional system is working. Despite efforts at voter suppression and other things, clearly, at least to this point, the electoral system worked. I mean, we had a midterm election in 2018 where the opposition party took control of the House of Representatives. That's a really big deal. That's an important part of making us a democratic republic. And so that part is intact. Now, I move to a second area where I think it's touch and go. The courts are complicated. And I think that when, at certain critical moments, the courts really did stand up for individual rights. And one of the things we count on courts to do, the rights of unpopular minorities. Mm-hmm. And so how they dealt at certain phases with what the administration was doing about refugees and about Muslims coming in the country and that sort of thing. But it was mixed because you also had, the evidence of partisanship, some tilting, obviously from my point of view, tilting toward the administration on issues where I didn't think they should, but making it neutral, just suggesting that the courts can get partisan in ways that should disturb us all, even when we agree with the decisions. There are certain kinds of issues where you really do not, there are certain issues where you got real disagreements and you understand how it can get a little partisan. There are other issues when it comes to individual rights where you really just want the courts to stand up for that. And on the whole, they did some good work, but it was troubling. Congress and the division of power, not so much, because the Republican Party, far more even than in earlier administrations, was petrified of going after Trump. And Richard Burr's work with Mark Warner on the Intelligence Committee of the Senate was somewhat bipartisan, actually. Mm-hmm. And that was sort of a case of some accountability. But what I came away with on the whole is a lot of stuff held up. We can feel good about that and be proud of that. But there were a lot of moments of warning where the constitutional system in the end is only as good as the people operating the levers of the system. And if there weren't people there willing to stand up for certain things, they could go by the boards. Look at all the norms that we thought we didn't have to legislate on, beginning with the president's going to release his taxes. The president's going to be independent of any private company while he's president, and on and on. We've just let go of all those norms. We assumed that we had a strong enough system that a lot of presidents would just do those things because those were the things we expected of them, and that didn't happen. I think one of the things that's going to happen after Trump is we're probably going to legislate a lot of those norms, which we didn't think we had to legislate before. So lastly, a lot will depend on the next 60 days. I mean, I find, again, I'm a Trump critic, but I don't think you have to be a Trump critic to say Joe Biden won the election. George W. Bush could say it, Mitt Romney could say it, Ben Sasse could say it, half the foreign leaders in the world, or at least the Democratic foreign leaders, small d Democratic foreign leaders of the world said it. There's no, Biden won by far more than Trump did the last time, and Hillary Clinton was pilloried by Republicans for not conceding that night. She conceded the next day, and she lost by less than Donald Trump lost to Joe Biden by. So how he fights this out, we were all hoping, breathing a sigh of relief and saying it's over, and it's probably not going to be over until January 20th. And firing all those people in the Defense Department, which is your bailiwick and something you know a lot about, sure was troubling, and you want to know what was that about. And I'm counting on journalists actually that Post had a good story on that today, and I'm counting for more on what the heck that was about.
Yeah, and what it means. So the one area that I wanted to ask you to elaborate on is executive authority. George Bush teed it up after 9/11. Obama certainly ran with it, and then Trump just tripled the kind of executive authority that either one of those two presidents went with. And I'm thinking not just of all his executive orders, which were so many, and they were big, and not just the firings, although I'd like you to talk about the firings, but also the lack of resistance in a meaningful way to any of those. And I'm hoping that it's explained, that there's more of an explanation than just the Republican Senate. But anyway, if you could just opine on the level of executive authority that he has used. Is it truly without precedent? And is it damaging to, is it potentially a lasting damage, and will some of that have to be legislated as well? Or at least debated or something?
Well, a couple of things. I think the origins of the latest I mean, we've had executive authority expanding since Woodrow Wilson to some degree. And, he took the big step, TR a little bit, Woodrow Wilson a lot, FDR a lot. Then with the Cold War, the existence of nuclear weapons, we have had a long history of expanding executive authority in the country. I think that it expanded some more because of gridlock, because of the inability of Congress to reach agreements on anything. A good example is immigration reform. Bush tried to get it through the Congress, and the Republicans killed it. The Republicans in the Senate, led by Jeff Sessions, killed it. I thought that was the first marker that pointed us to Trump coming down the road, is when Bush couldn't get an immigration reform through the Republican Congress. And so Obama comes along, and there are certain things he thinks he has to fix that he can't fix, so he's going to do it by executive order. The DACA executive order being a good example, which actually wasn't all that different than an earlier executive order Bush had issued. It was a little more expansive in the number of people it covered. But he felt he did have authority to do that, and he didn't want to deport all these kids who came with their parents, as little kids, and who are now American in every way except their papers. And so some of that is a failure of Congress and the White House to agree on legislation. With Trump, I'm glad you brought up the firings, because I think the firings are really troublesome, partly just how he ran the government, just as a matter of competence, the way he ran through people, partly because I want a president, whether it's a president I agree with or not, who has some people around him who take issue with him, who say, you're wrong about this. Maybe you got to do this differently. I can think of a lot of moments in history where I really would have liked somebody in the room and saying, maybe invading Iraq is not such a good idea, say. Trump in this courtier style he demands, just got rid of anybody over time who disagreed with him, in a way that I think was very destructive of his administration. I think this latest executive order on the civil servants is really scary, because it would really gut the civil service tradition of of having people who are insulated from political pressure.
Can you explain what that is?
Yeah, Trump issued an executive order which is really designed to reclassify a lot of people as political appointees so that you could fire them. In other words, civil servants are protected from firing except for extraordinary circumstances. They generally follow the lead of an administration. It's not like they're a bunch of rogues. Republicans always think civil servants are Democrats, and maybe they are probably more Democratic than politicals of a Republican, the political appointees of a Republican administration, but they tend to follow the lead of the administration. But this is designed to really roll back reforms that were put in by, as it happens, a Republican president in the 1880s and have been built on over the years. But so the firings are a problem. I think one of the fun things for academics to do when Trump is gone will be to examine all these executive orders, because I think a lot of them were simply pieces of paper. I think that one of the ways Donald Trump showed that he was doing a lot, and he's got that big, huge signature of his, which he really seems to like to write. That's all right. I won't. Yeah, right. Exactly. And that's okay. John Hancock had a big signature too. I think a lot of them were just declaratory that didn't do anything, but were a way for him to say he did some things.
Yeah.
And others did some real damage. So I'm not sure you're going to have that much of a check on executive power. It may come from the Supreme Court. And then we'll see how aggressive a Republican Senate is in having rather different principles about a Joe Biden administration than they had about a Donald Trump administration. And I'm not sure that's an improvement. But we'll see what they do. I think we're going to live with a lot of executive power until a party has an ability to legislate again.
Yeah.
Like
So
maybe it depends on the Georgia runoffs.
Yay.
Yeah, go ahead.
All right. So I want to bring you up to the present moment and tell us how you think this election is going to play out. How's this process and Trump's demands and the Republicans' acquiescence so far? How's that going to play out?
I think at some point he has to back off, because there is very little, and this isn't just somebody who doesn't like Trump. There are a lot of conservative lawyers who looked at these lawsuits and said, there's nothing here. The grounds aren't there for these lawsuits that he's filing. Ben Ginsberg is one of the best Republican lawyers in town. He fought Bush v. Gore on the Bush side. I've invited him to a couple of things at Brookings where I always introduce him by saying that I admire him as a lawyer so much that if I wanted to steal an election, Ben Ginsberg is the guy I would hire. So he's a really good partisan Republican lawyer. And he has attacked these. He thinks these are crazy. He thinks the Republicans are being crazy in doing this. And so I think this stops at some point.
Do you think we'll see
and
a lot
I think
more suits?
They're going to keep, Trump. One of the things Trump is really good at is filing lawsuits. They're not necessarily good lawsuits, but he files a lot of them. My hunch is the Republicans may stay at this until the Georgia runoffs. I think one of the sad things going on here is that Mitch McConnell and the Republicans really want to win at least one, and preferably both from their point of view, of the 2 seats in Georgia. They win one, they got a majority. They lose them both, Democrats have a majority. They are very worried that the Trump voters will not turn out. Some Trump voters will not turn out if Trump's name is not on the ballot. The theory is that if you keep this fight going, if you keep Trump as viable, if you are nice to Trump about this, there are stories that Trump, and I haven't confirmed these stories, but that Trump sort of issued veiled threats to McConnell that if they didn't back them, he wasn't going to help them in the Senate races down in Georgia. So a lot of this could be about 2 Senate races in Georgia, and that after January 5th, they might relent. and they might back off. But there's a lot of that's a lot of lost time for a transition in the middle of a pandemic, when the pandemic is getting worse, when the economy is in a mess, when you need more action by Congress if the economy isn't going to fall into a further mess. And any transition, even a good one, is difficult. You're changing a lot in a short period of time. And so I think this is just so deeply troubling. In the session that you and I were in before, somebody who had been in the Foreign Service spoke about how people he had worked with abroad on behalf of democracy were all excited that, we had a free election, you could defeat an incumbent. And then last few days, they've called him, and I'm not quoting him exactly, but it sounds like that, this is a reversion to the kind of thing you expect in a non-democratic country. And that's very depressing for us, to me, and I think it should be to a lot of people, including Republicans.
Do you think there's a way that the Biden administration can continue in some manner to be in a transition, even while the lawsuits are going forward?
Yeah, they have already. I mean, Biden has been very good about just saying, "I'm going ahead." He named his 500 people, and who are he's got people covering every agency. There are clearly a lot of back channels to information in government, as you know better than anybody. So I think they will be able to gather an awful lot of information that they need. I think they will be able to do that. But I think that, on foreign policy, especially with the firings at defense, where you really want some sense of togetherness in our standing in the world. And I think on the pandemic, where you need sort of real action now, real cooperation of all levels of government now, this is a very bad time to have this kind of transition.
Yeah. I mean, one thing I've noticed, back to the media for a second, and then we're going to have to take questions. We're going to not have to, we will love to take questions. Is the media shift to Biden? I actually thought they underplayed during the campaign, because Trump, again, gets so many more viewers than, Biden at a drive-through. And I think, a lot of people could criticize whether this was really a fair covering of both sides. But that said, I do think the media shifted in a way that they always do after an election towards the winner, and they're covering everything that he says and covering it just like they would an incoming president, and have at the end of their, report, whether it's a report on NPR or whatever, they will say, and Trump continues to do X, Y, and Z. But the media, at least, are covering Biden as if he's the president-elect, and what he says now matters, and we're going to tell you on the front page what he's saying. And that, to me, is a good sign. What do you think?
Well, look at the New York Times. I don't know if anybody can read it out there. This was a remarkable headline.
Oh, yeah, that was great.
In this morning's New York Times. The headline, all columns in block type: election officials nationwide find no fraud. Now that's amazing, and it's a story where they've gone all over the place looking for fraud, but that is as direct a way of saying the president is lying without using that word. I mean, that sent a really powerful message about what's going on. I smiled this morning when I opened up my New York Times and saw that headline and said, they're really trying to say, even if you like the president, even if you're sad about his not being reelected, we've all gone through elections we lost. There really isn't fraud, guys. It's not there. Because at the moment, there's a poll in Politico that 70% of Republicans think it's not a fair election. And so, spreading this stuff, the way the president spreads this stuff, a lot of people on his side are going to believe it. This is a particularly big lie because the data's there. And as somebody said, how can Republicans say we won the Senate on the basis of a fraudulent election? The same people who won those races are on the same ballots. As unless only fraud is committed in places that didn't vote Republican. I mean, it's really problematic.
The other great thing about that article, and I suggest everybody read it because it's so great, is that these reporters managed to reach every single election head, except for Texas, where no one would call them back. But in every case, they got to the election head of the election process, or they got a statement from them right away. To me, that signals that no matter if they're in a Republican state or a Democratic state, whoever that is very proud of their process and has checked it and is willing to tell the New York Times, that is seen as liberal, what happened in their state. And that those same people will do the same if they're asked, in a court, if they're asked in some other forum. So, it was really heartwarming, the methodology that they used to do it. And I thought, that's in the end what's going to get us to move ahead, regardless of what the Senate says, regardless of what Trump
I
says.
couldn't agree more. No, I think that's so important. 2 quick points on that. One, the Secretary of State of Georgia, Republican, conservative Republican, is under attack from the 2 Senate candidates because he's basically saying this was a fair count. And he's standing up for his system and all the local officials who did the counting. These are local people who care about their local communities. My sister, Navy vet, is the chair of the board of canvassers for her town of Middletown, Rhode Island. And they really cared about making it easier for people to vote. And lots of people went up to my sister, whether they were Republicans or Democrats, and said, thanks for trying to make it easier in this tough period to vote. And I cite my sister because I'm proud of my sister, of course, but she stands in for lots of people like that all over the country. She wasn't doing it to fix the ballot. She's not even paid in this job. But she really took it very seriously when the pandemic hit. All the people who worked elections wanted to figure out how did we make this as easy as possible under a very difficult circumstance. She went to high schools to recruit poll workers because the older folks weren't going to be able to work the polls. That's people all over the country do stuff like that.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I think we are going to see Sandy, the question man. Sandy's
good. I like that. It was like a miraculous appearance of Sandy on the corner.
Magically appeared. Well, it's time to go to the audience for Q&A, but really we're just going to carry on with the same conversation. There's a lot of questions here about the Senate, but I really want to go to the first question, which is from Lou and Linda Gavioli. And just for our watchers out there, these are recent folks in Santa Fe who are longtime friends of EJ that helped bring EJ to our screen and ideally coming to Santa Fe sometime soon.
I sure hope so.
So their question is a good one, which is, EJ, your book, Code Red, described how moderates and progressives could get together in the Democratic Party for the good of the country. Is your next book going to give the recipe for how Democrats and Republicans can get along to save this country?
Ooh, I love that. That's a very Gaviolian question. I appreciate that. I wish I had the answer. I wrote the book about the easier topic, even though if you look at how Democrats were clawing each other's hair out last week after the House elections, this topic is hard enough because, as you saw, moderates and progressive Democrats were sort of really screaming at each other on this phone call. I guess I've written a lot about the Republicans and the right over the years. I wrote a book a few years ago called Why the Right Went Wrong. And I always say my dirty little secret in life is that I was a teenage liberal Republican. And the reason that's a dirty secret is not having to do with liberal or Republican, but the most boring thing you could possibly be as a teenager is a liberal Republican, I think. I've always thought, I look back at that tradition and it was an incredibly constructive tradition in our life. And if you look back at somebody like Dwight Eisenhower, who, among other things, created the student loan program that helped me go to college, built the interstate highways. He did a lot of stuff that was very constructive. He was very conservative. He was very fiscally conservative. And you look back at people like Ed Brooke or Jacob Javits, or the Republicans wrote a lot of the civil rights bills back in the 60s in the Voting Rights Act. And I think that the Republican Party has been veering right, starting with Goldwater, and has just kept moving rightward from Goldwater to Reagan, then to Gingrich, and it's sort of been on a radicalizing course. And many of us hope that if Trump was thumped, to use George W. Bush's nice old word about the 2006 midterms, if Trump was really thumped, they might sort of have sit back and say maybe we should reconsider what we've been doing. I'm worried that this election was not decisive enough in that respect, and I don't know if I don't see how Mitch McConnell will suddenly change if the Republicans do win those Georgia runoffs. I'm hoping that Biden can start with stuff like infrastructure. At least we can agree on building stuff. Although there was a Republican I was very friendly with in the House who passed away a couple of years ago, and he quit the House. And he said, I quit the House. He was chair of the subcommittee on roads and transit and all that. And he said, I quit Congress because we couldn't even build roads anymore, and that there is such opposition to using government in any way. That this is in one of the most radically conservative parties in the world. You're from Canada. Canada's previous prime minister was pretty conservative, but that party is not as right-wing as this party. The Tories in Britain historically aren't as right-wing as this party. The Christian Democrats in Germany aren't as right-wing in this party. I think back to conservatives like Eisenhower, Macmillan, Adenauer in Germany. These were very constructive conservative figures. That's the kind of conservatism I think we need, and I don't think we've had it for a while. So that's, I hate to put it that way, because right now the Democratic Party is this coalition of all the people who used to be moderate Republicans all the way over to the left, because they couldn't find a place in the Republican Party. So of course there are big fights.
Well, let's carry that conversation into the Senate itself. And I'm going to build on a question here posed by Rich Moriarty. And he asks, have any Republican senators said things after the election, as background or anonymously, that give you hope they might join with Democratic senators to enact majority legislation in the next Congress? And as sort of a follow-on to that, there are questions about whether Susan Collins might adjust her perspective, and then of course what Mitch McConnell might do, and whether he might just become Dr. No once again.
I mean, I think you've got to assume he's going to be Dr. No until we learn otherwise. Again, if you want to be just purely Machiavellian about it, the easiest way to unite the Republican Party will be an opposition party. That's why they went into opposition to Obama after 2008, and it worked. They were a really tough, if you look at it from their point of view, they were a really tough, focused opposition, and they won the midterm elections in 2010 by a really big margin. And so history, I think, tells them that it may be in their interest to do exactly the same thing again, and that may be their best path to winning in 2022. I'd like to think they might come to a little bit of a different conclusion looking at some of the states that are up, some of the senators who are up, but I don't have a lot of confidence. I do think Biden is a figure who does not inspire a lot of instinctive opposition from a lot of Republicans. He's a very comfortable figure to a lot of those folks. He's certainly had a lot of dealings with McConnell over the years. I think if he does start with infrastructure, tries to get more aid into the economy, but even there, McConnell is signaling he doesn't want to spend any more money to lift up the economy. And I really worry that if we don't pump more money into the economy, particularly into state and local governments that are going to start having these massive layoffs, we are going to have a really tough time getting the economy moving. And this isn't some left-wing Keynesian view. This is what most business people think. They really want money flowing into this economy to get it moving. And so I'm not very optimistic, unfortunately, about how the Senate Republicans will deal with Biden. And I hope I'm wrong. And I hope Biden is right that he can deal with these guys. And as I say, I do think he's a comfortable enough figure for them that it's going to be hard for them to demonize him. And I think a lot of them aren't going to want to demonize him. I hope at least I'm right about that.
Well, let's switch to talk about the media a little bit. There's a great question here from Adam Wasserman. He says, the New York Times just published a piece about a mass shift of Republicans from Facebook and Twitter, and even Fox News, to other platforms encouraged by political and media figures. Huh. Could the result of the election be to further entrench them into an alternative reality with particular respect to the election?
Yes. The short answer is yes. I think that is very, very possible. The amount of grief that the guy at Fox News who called Arizona for Biden is just astonishing. How much really nasty stuff came his way just because he called the state for Biden on Fox News. That's amazing. And I do worry about these sort of this siloed opinion world, siloed world of fact we live in, which is not factual, and the ease with which you can spread misinformation, and the way people operate on trust, and trust is something that tends to be given these days almost entirely on ideological lines. And that that becomes really problematic. I want people, people can agree with me because they're liberals, but I'd like them to have trust in what I write factually, because I write factually, not because they're liberals, if you know what I mean. And I really worry about this world. On the other hand, maybe if there is a multiplicity of these things, it'll be less effective than one big, powerful Fox News. It's truly extraordinary how influential. Fox News is so influential that a pollster friend of mine has started dividing Republicans into Fox News Republicans and non-Fox News Republicans. And about 40 to 50% of Republicans say Fox News is their most trusted source. And they are significantly to the right and of other kinds of Republicans, and have different views of the facts. So maybe a little more diversity there, although I suppose it could get crazier than Fox News. I think it's fascinating how Murdoch has played this, because Murdoch seems to accept that Joe Biden is the next president. And I'm curious what that's going to do to things.
Well, let's go into more speculative waters. Assuming Trump eventually concedes and takes up what many people believe will be his next post as a media commentator of some sort on some sort of platform, and a lot of folks have some concerns about that. Do you think the press should cover this man? I mean, will the press lose its kind of, I don't want to say love affair, but it's kind of obsession with covering addiction. That's much better. With
addiction is right. Not entirely. I mean, on the one hand, I noticed even before, there's been a sharp decline from 2016. In 2016, the obsession with Trump was so complete that empty Trump podiums got more coverage than almost all the Republicans who ran against him put together. It was crazy what happened in 2016. Again, putting aside, let's assume you are a Republican. If you looked at the coverage of the primaries, you had serious candidates in there. You had Jeb Bush, you had Rubio, you had Christie, you had a lot of people there with real experience, really plausible, Ted Cruz for that matter, really plausible presidents. And Trump just blew them all out in the coverage because of what Dana said earlier, which is Trump was ratings, Trump was interesting, Trump had been a television star. And I think this time was very different. You didn't see empty Trump podiums. You didn't see as much constant Trump on the air. And so I think there'll be a sharp decline in coverage of Trump when he's not president. I'm not sure coverage of Trump will go away. I think there'll be more critical coverage of Trump. I think what's going to be interesting is how will Republicans welcome this or not? What if you are a kind of Trumpist Republican, or, Trump sympathizing Republican like Tom Cotton or Josh Hawley, and you yourself would like to be the Republican nominee in 2024? On the one hand, you want to stay right with Trump because your hope is you will get support from the people who supported Trump. On the other hand, you really don't want him taking up all the oxygen so you have no room to emerge. So I think there are going to be some interesting, and then there'll be parts of the party that really kind of do want him to go away. So I think there are going to be some interesting Republican dynamics to follow on this that may affect the press dynamics. I mean, what's happening out there in the world of power and action has an impact on the media, because the media cover power and action. So I think that's watching the Republicans deal with ex-President Trump will be a lot of fun. And I'll certainly hope to do some of it myself.
Add, EJ, that I think one of the most interesting things that will happen is, will Trump try to incite actual violence, actual action on the part of people who are willing and who have the means to take action? And one of the things I think will be a big story is how many of those people are really out there? How well are they organized? If Trump says this election is not legitimate, are they going to prepare more, or is it just an inflated fear on our part?
I think we've seen enough bad stuff happen, like the ramming of the Biden bus and the motorcade down in Texas. That was very scary. On the other side, the good news is on election day, I was really worried about more violence and more things happening at polling places. And we had a peaceful election, and that heartened me. I thought that was good for the country, but also a good sign that there may be a limit on this. So, the problem is it only takes a rather small number of highly incited violent people to cause a lot of trouble. And, the FBI has told us that they're more worried about terrorist actions from ultra-right, white supremacists at the moment than they are from people from abroad. So he could do damage that way. But I guess I want to use the election day to be more on the optimistic side of this and say maybe we are more worried than, obviously I want public officials to be vigilant, but maybe we shouldn't be quite as worried as we are now. I hope I don't regret those words. But election day was at least one concrete indicator that maybe we can get through this period okay.
Well, I'm going to ask you one more question, which I think is a great question that gets us out of this fierce world of politics and transition. This is from Michaela Hulayan at UNM, University of New Mexico. And she says, what do you consider to be the point where an opinion piece has crossed the line? Or is there a line to be crossed?
Well, the most important line that you can never cross, I think, is to lie or to make up facts. My view is a small factual error can undercut your whole argument. And people can say this person doesn't know what he's talking about, or worse, that he's manipulating things. I've had this history of wonderful assistants, and one of the first things I tell my assistants is, I want you to say terrible things to me about my column. I want you to read this incredibly critically. I want you to fact check it. I want you to look at every sentence. And if it's lousy, I want you to tell me. Because I don't want to make mistakes. I think beyond that, what crosses the line, I can't imagine doing it, but I suppose issuing threats to people or something like that, or inciting violence, or I would think that is crossing the line. I'm trying to figure out which lines that she is talking about. I mean, I have gotten tougher and angrier over recent years because of what I see going on around me. What I see going on in the country, and it's worried me about the country. I still have tried to stay in touch with people I disagree with. I've still gone out of my way sometime to give a nod to points of view that aren't mine, that are plausible. And in fact, in some ways, the best opinion columns are the ones that try to answer the best version of the other side rather than a set of straw men. I still think that's true. But beyond sort of fact and obscenity and horrible writing, I leave a pretty big room for opinion. I guess the other thing is I like to read people I learn from. And so there are a lot of people I disagree with. I've always been a big consumer of opinion ever since I was a kid, actually. And I have learned a lot from conservatives. I always say that Bill Buckley is perversely strangely one of my heroes, because I'd like to be about 5% as effective for my side as Bill Buckley was for his side. And unfortunately, I'll never have that house in Switzerland or the sailboat. But, he was somebody I thought had an enormous impact on American politics. And while I disagreed with a lot of what he wrote, he also drew some useful lines. He really read anti-Semitism out of the right. I wonder what he'd make of its reappearance now. He went after the John Birch Society for extremism, calling out his own side. And I guess that's the last thing I'll say. I guess I think our standards should be the standards of democracy. I mean, we are here. Journalism, we talk about being fair-minded and we talk about being balanced and all those kinds of things. But ultimately, if we are not here to defend the truth and democracy, I don't know what the point of journalism is. We're here to contribute to the conversation of a democratic republic, to tell citizens of the democratic republic what's going on, to help them make judgments. We're here to hold governments accountable. One reason why I worry about the decline of local media, the fact so many local papers are going out of business. There's no one covering City Hall, no one covering the county government. If we are not committed to democracy, then I think we are not doing our jobs. And so I guess I'll close by just saying thanks to you guys. First, thanks to Dana. What a delight to be with her and for her work on behalf of democracy. But thanks for you guys, because what you're doing is really underscoring that, without a democracy, we can't have a free press. But without a free press, democracy is in trouble. And so I think you guys recognize both sides of that, and I appreciate it so much. Thank you.
Thank you so much, EJ. What a great pleasure. I look forward to hearing more of your remarks in person, hopefully sooner than later. Thank you so much for taking the time. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, it was great.
What a great joy. Thank you.
See you next year in Santa Fe.
Yeah. And thank
Absolutely. We got to do this again and for real. Bye-bye.